All right. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our press briefing on deaths in jails and prisons. I'm going to give some housekeeping notes while people are joining in. I'm Michelle Billman. I work for the Marshall Project. I coordinate a program called Investigate This, which provides criminal justice data sets and other reporting resources for local journalists that are looking to investigate deaths in custody and provide other accountability coverage for their communities. And so today, we're joined by an esteemed panel of experts in this space. They're working every day to shed light on the people who are dying behind bars and what's happening. We have Andrea Armstrong. She is a law professor at Loyola University, New Orleans. She's a MacArthur Fellow and an incarceration law scholar who runs the Incarceration Transparency Database. We have Terence Keel, a professor at UCLA. He runs the In Custody Death Project, and he's got a book coming out later this year about state violence and the medical examiner system. And then we have Orion Taylor, who is the lead data scientist for NYU's Public Safety Lab, where he oversees what's called the Jail Data Initiative. And we'll be sharing links in the chat to all of these resources, and you'll be hearing a lot from our experts today on the work that they're doing. Along with our panelists, we have moderators from the Marshall Project. Brittany Haler is a staff writer who recently co-reported on 2 deaths at the jail in Cleveland and has done extensive reporting in this area. Anna Flagg is our other moderator. She is a senior data reporter and has covered prison deaths during COVID and the Death in Custody Reporting Act in great detail. And then we also have joining us Nicole Lewis, who is the Marshall Project's engagement editor. She will be monitoring questions that come in through the Q&A function of the webinar, as well as the chat. You're welcome to add questions at any point, and we're hoping to get to as many as possible today. We will have a Q&A, a dedicated Q&A portion of the event after you get to hear from our experts. And then if we can't get to some of the questions today, the Marshall Project will be making efforts to follow up with you and providing context to help with your reporting. And then our hope really today is that you leave the event with more context, as well as quotes or sound bites that you can plug into your local reporting. That's why everything today is on the record. We'll be sharing this recording with you in a recap email later this week, and we'll have a transcript as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Anna Flagg.
Thanks, Michelle. So like Michelle mentioned, I'm a data reporter here, and Brittany is our Marshall Project expert on reporting on deaths in custody. She's done a ton of coverage on jail deaths in particular, and her recent investigation into the Cuyahoga County Jail in Cleveland revealed negligence and critical failures in jail medical care that led to preventable deaths. So I just think Brittany's work is so ambitious and instructive to other reporters working in this space. And I feel very glad to have the chance to moderate this discussion with her and our other incredible experts here. So yeah, let's just get started. Professor Andrea Armstrong, I'd love to start with you. You're a professor of law at the Loyola University in New Orleans, where you run a project called Incarceration Transparency. You and your law students file records requests and document jail and prison deaths. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and why you chose to create this database?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful for everybody who's chosen to attend, but also for Investigate This and the Marshall Project for doing this incredible work. I'd like to share just an overview slide, basically, of what this looks like, what we do. And it's really 3 different buckets that I do with my law students. So every year I teach a seminar, and the law students basically file public records requests with every single prison or jail or youth detention center in the state of Louisiana. So right now that's about 133. And we do that at the facility level because the data that did exist back when we started, which was in 2019, none of it was at the facility level, which meant that even if we had an understanding of what was happening across the state, we as local citizens and local residents wouldn't know what was happening in our own backyard. And so we really started at the facility level. And what we've been able to do is collect forms that were submitted to the federal government on deaths in custody under the Federal Death in Custody Reporting Act. So what we have been able to do is, one, create the first ever list of the people who have died in Louisiana that is publicly available. It is on a database on our website. And through that, you can not only look for a person's name, but you can also look for trends and patterns. You can search by facility. But in addition to that data and the data analysis, and we put out periodic reports looking at that, we also look to memorialize the lives that were lost. And so students will do background research. They are trained in trauma-informed interviewing skills. And then we attempt to find friends and family member to talk about what we lose when someone dies behind bars. And here, on this slide, you see memorials that were written for Plucky and for Christian. But we've got about 50 of them so far. And every year we try and complete another 10 to 15, often in partnership with the families. Then the last is we compile information about the actual facilities themselves. People know a lot about the New Orleans jail or the East Baton Rouge jail, but they know less about their local parish jail in Acadia Parish, for instance, or Caddo. And so we combine that with audits that we have collected, other publicly available materials, so that people can understand how these places are operating. In addition to this work, our project also facilitates a national group of data researchers. We gave ourselves a name, the Carceral Death Data Collaborative, I'm sorry. And it is really a mutual aid society. We help each other as we do this in our own different ways across jurisdictions. That's a little bit about what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. For the journalists that are joining us, if they're covering this, what areas would they reach out to you about if they're working on a story about deaths in custody?
If they're working on a story about deaths in custody, certainly the Federal Death in Custody Reporting Act. But in addition, if it happens behind bars, I am interested in it and looking at it and researching it, right? And so what we know is deaths in custody often involve and implicate healthcare available behind bars, right? So physical and mental health, suicides, drug preventions, use of force, security, discipline, all of these different things are really coming together under the hat of deaths in custody. And I work on all of those issues. So I focus on labor, healthcare, and deaths.
Thank you. We're going to move to Terence. Terence, you are a UCLA professor of human biology and society and African American studies, and you run the In Custody Death Project, which produces reports on people who lost their lives while in state custody. This project is the basis for your forthcoming book, The Coroner's Silence: Death Records and Hidden Victims of Police Violence, from Beacon Press. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this book?
Absolutely. And good afternoon. It's great to see everyone here. And it's great to have this sort of new, I think, collaborative space between academic researchers and media. I think we need this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just share my screen with all of us and talk a little bit about the work that I do in the lab. So I direct a lab here at UCLA where we've really been focused on in custody deaths. And I think for us, it's a real turning point for, I would say, all of us here, was the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the public nature of these deaths, and also the inability to kind of comprehend the death record for these cases. The way that these autopsies are often written, they downplay, minimize, and ignore the violence that law enforcement inflict on the bodies of people who are arrested. And so there are really sort of four components of what we do in this lab. We use data science to pull together the names of people who have died in custody. So we're interested in people who die in jail, but also people who die during arrest and on the streets. And that data, the street data, is difficult because the available sources for this sort of work are piecemeal at best. And so we've been really successful using crowdsourced data sets, which I can talk a little bit more about. And then from there, once we identify the people who died in custody, we use FOIA requests, working largely within open record states. Once we gather these autopsies, we've developed a sophisticated protocol that allows us to analyze death records, like this autopsy we have here, and turn each record into a series of data points. And we use those data points to understand risk factors, correlations between the kinds of injuries that people are sustaining or the illnesses that they have and the way they're being classified, racial demographic information. These things are really important to get a sense of how either being arrested or being in jail accelerates pre-existing conditions and creates early death. And from there, we publish our findings with our community partners. We are really working nationally right now, and we've got a really strong alliance with organizers and groups in DC, Washington, Pennsylvania, here in Los Angeles, and also in counties in Alameda and San Bernardino and San Diego. And then from there, what our reports really allow us to do is it allows us to kind of put into the hands of community organizers data that they need to talk with elected officials to start thinking about policy and legislative change. And so for us, from nuts to bolts, it's about finding out who's dying, understanding the risk factors that create death in custody, working with community organizers on the ground, and seeing if we can get some legislative change to create greater transparency and greater accountability for these kinds of losses.
Thanks so much, Terence. And for the reporters in the room, again, what areas should they reach out to you about?
I would say what we're really good at doing is offering secondary analysis of death records and autopsy cases. And that's for people who are dying in jail or people who are dying in the streets. I think that's something we're really, really strong at. I think we're also really good at working with crowdsourced data to try to figure out names of people who've died in custody. I would say those are our really strong suits. And then, if you have local organizations that are trying to understand what's going on in other counties and other states around death in custody, we're a good resource for that because we've got our hands in multiple counties and multiple states.
Gotcha, thank you. Orion Taylor, you're lead data scientist at New York University's Public Safety Lab, where you oversee the Jail Data Initiative to scrape daily jail rosters for counties that post their population records online. Your database includes over 1,300 counties, which people can access through the dashboard to see if their local jail is included. Now, this data isn't specifically about deaths, it's about the populations of people going in and out of jails, which is crucial information to join to the deaths data to understand better the death patterns that are happening. Can you talk a little bit about how your data can be used for that purpose?
Sure, thanks. So the Jail Data Initiative, as you mentioned, is just a database of bookings, basically, that we've scraped from local jail rosters. So as a lot of you probably know, this data is sort of piecemeal. It's not available everywhere. So we've sort of put together this first look national picture of jail booking records. And let me just share my screen really quickly. Oops, sorry. All right, so this is sort of like our dashboard website. We collect and aggregate records. We have individual level records available for access, and then we sort of do sort of rudimentary analysis of county level information. As part of this, one thing that I had to do personally was go through every county in the US and Google basically like county jail to see if there was a jail roster available online. And something that I started to notice was every time I searched, one of the first few records would be a local reporting piece about a death in custody in that jail. So I had a side project that I sort of took on here, which I called just U.S. deaths in custody, which was just to put together a data visualization representing one such death in each county where I could come across. So each of these represents like a local reporting piece. And it was sort of just like a really striking entree into specifically deaths in custody, from this data angle. So, yeah.
And Orion, what for the reporters in the room again, I'll ask you that question too. What should what kind of areas should they reach out to you about?
Right, sorry. Our data is basically available to anyone who wants it. So reporters use it often merged with other data sources. So for instance, if you wanted to look at if you had medical examiners records locally and you wanted to merge them with jail records to sort of link up people's bookings and what they were charged with and how long they were in jail and things of that nature, and get a better context for their death, that would be like a good use case.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I think we're gonna move to the Q&A portion now. So please feel free to put questions in the chat, which I think a lot of you already are doing, so that's great. And yeah, I'll just maybe kick things off with a question for all of the panelists. What is the importance of tracking deaths that occur in custody? And why is this accountability and transparency so important?
Sure, I'll start with this because I think it's critically important, right? So deaths are actually, in many cases, a symbol or a signifier of greater problems within that facility, right? So deaths is kind of like the tip of the iceberg, and you can see when you start analyzing and looking at the patterns that the facility is actually having significant problems along one of several axes, right? So it could be around supervision and staffing. It could be around medical care provision, the ability to provide care. It could be around mental health care and the ability to continue prescriptions for people who have entered the jail, for instance. And so, deaths, by analyzing them, we can understand what's actually happening in that facility. But I think more broadly, particularly when we think about jails, none of the people, or very few of the people at least, nationwide who die in custody were really sentenced to death, right? And so understanding that deaths should be atypical, they should be unusual occurrences. And so when they occur, they demand our attention.
I can hop in with another question if Terence and Orion feel like Andrea kind of nailed it. Okay. So this is something that I'm always wondering is like, what aspects of this topic are journalists missing? Or what is missing from most media coverage in some way? Is there some gap you feel frustrated by, or something you wish we were thinking about more carefully?
Yeah, I think this is a question that I've grappled with quite a bit since doing this work and starting this work. There's a couple things I'll say. I think journalists need to do more than give American stories about people dying in custody. We need to profile these people. We need to humanize these deaths, and that's important work. But there's something more that the public needs beyond this. I think we need journalists to sort of pair the empathy that you would generate by telling a very textured story about someone who lost their life in custody with real investigative journalism about the structural conditions that are creating these deaths at every level. So local elected officials, the way that law enforcement are interacting with people who, quite frankly, should have institutions of care and not policing. I think this is what these deaths are telling us. I think this is, to Andrea's point, people who are dying is another evidence that law enforcement are really not equipped to deal with mental illness, how people dealing with substance abuse issues, being unhoused, et cetera. I also think that there needs to be just a bit more work to help Americans shift our thinking about law and order politics. I think in many ways, American media is still stuck in the 90s, where there's crime, we want to spotlight it, we want to talk about it. But if you think and you poll Americans and their ideas around capital punishment, most Americans are generally just declining support of capital punishment. And if you really think about what an in-custody death is, it's another form of capital punishment. People are often dying before trial, so before they're going in front of a judge, and they are usually dying from nonviolent offenses. People who are loitering, people who are, not paying citations, people who are having public drunkenness. And so I think there needs to be some constitutive work between journalists connecting these issues with larger sentiments around that Americans have who don't support the death penalty, who have concerns that we might be killing innocent people. I think death in custody, particularly pretrial deaths, are one of these kind of crises of democracy that we need journalists to help Americans kind of think about this in a more progressive forward way.
The other thing I would add to that too, just quickly, is people that are actually arrested at a hospital seeking either psychiatric help during crisis or having a pre-existing condition, then, you know, spitting on a nurse or having some sort of episode and then ending up in jail and then dying of their pre-existing condition. And I think that's a clear kind of pipeline that I'm seeing a lot too. Did Orion or Andrea, did you want to add anything to that gap question? No. Okay.
So maybe we can take some of the questions from the chat, and then I think we also had some questions that were submitted earlier. So maybe can you guys talk a little bit about the carceral facilities other than prisons and jails and like law enforcement or like police stations? So ICE detention centers kind of comes to mind, and there's been a lot of change in those recently and how those are run and how many people are in them. So anything that you guys can advise about that?
Sure. So I work with kind of prisons, jails, police lockups, youth detention centers. We don't, in our project, cover federal facilities, whether that is a federal prison or a DHS kind of site by contract with a private company, for instance. But there are organizations that do. Andrew Free, in particular, and Eunice Cho at the ACLU. Both of those individuals track and specifically focus on deaths that occur in ICE custody. And then I'll just, in addition, add that here in Louisiana and in a number of other states, we're increasingly seeing folks who are detained for ICE in our local jails. And so when that happens, they obviously cross our radar because it's happening in a local jail instead of in a BOP or a DHS run facility.
Another question that we got ahead of time was, are there particular keywords or types of documents that tend to yield the most useful data when requesting records for deaths in custody? And how would you approach investigating a death in custody when incident reports or other documents are maybe unreliable?
I'm happy to jump in. I don't want to speak too much. Terence, why don't you go ahead?
I'm not sure if I understand the first question about keyword searches, but what I can tell you is that generally an autopsy or death record is comprised of at least three things: the anatomical observation, which is usually conducted by a licensed physician; a narrative written usually by a forensic coroner who is not a physician, who arrives at the scene and interviews law enforcement and witnesses. And this can be true in the street or also in the jail environment. And then a toxicology report. If I were to think about the three that are the most, I mean, all are essential because they tell different versions of what happened. But generally, we find that the coroner's investigator narrative is really important because they're giving you a window into what happened the moments prior, during, and after someone died. And these details are really important because they can tell you a little bit about the perceptions of the person by law enforcement before they died. Did the police say that the person appeared to be on drugs? Were they compliant or not? Do they mention details that are irrelevant to why they died? These are really important details because they give you a sense of what the nature of the interaction was between police and law enforcement. But what we're finding in many cases, particularly as counties are beginning to get more aware, and this is another point I think I want to raise, there are counties around the nation right now advancing bills trying to restrict access to death records. And this is, I believe, one of many crises of democracy and democratic accountability. And we need journalists to help with this fight. The fact that death records are even available to us the fact that we even have FOIA is because media really pushed and advocated to create transparency in the production of records by the county. And there's a lot of misperceptions about what is included in a death record. They're not photos. We don't look at photos. States have long established in their state legislature that they will not include photos for these cases. So we're looking at the documents that the county themselves write. And many of the arguments being advanced with these bills is that they're disclosing sensitive medical information. What actually isn't true either. What's being disclosed are relevant health history that allows any member of the public to understand what that person might have been dealing with in terms of a pre-existing condition and how that might have contributed to their dying. This information is a public good. We need this information. So I think I think this is one of those sort of moments where we need more than just academic researchers or communities on the ground kind of advocating for getting these records. We need media also to be sort of in the fight with us.
I would just add to that, I think to the first point, which is, thinking about what types of documents are available. I think what Terence just shared was thinking about uh, files that might be available from the local coroner or medical examiner. That's one venue. Another is going to the facility itself, right, and doing public records requests. Another is going to what's called a state administering agency. And basically, every state has one of those. And what that agency's job is to collect death and custody information under the federal law and submit it to Washington, D.C. And so, in some cases, you can go to that state administrating agency and do a public records request for certain things. But at the same time, you have to understand that there are 50 different states. They all have different provisions for their state public records laws. In some states, a death certificate is public information, it is a public record. In other states, it is not. And so, to some extent, this is going to depend on where you are. Um, in addition, there's all types of other pieces of information you can get, right? So you could file a public records request with the local police department for 911 calls to a particular address, namely the address of the jail, right? And see how many times is an ambulance coming in and out of there, right? And that'll give you some idea of like how often is that happening and gives you a trail of documents that you can start then kind of unraveling and looking for, and then crowdsourcing, basically looking between the 911 records and the to the extent there's any investigations. I will last say that people who are incarcerated and staff, but particularly people who are incarcerated, they see all of this. All of these deaths, by and large, have some sort of witness element, right? And so even figuring out did the death, was it on a particular tier, right? And then crowdsourcing who else was on that tier at the time, right? There's lots of different ways. I've worked with families in particular where they've gotten calls from people who were on the tier to say something's not right. We haven't heard or seen your son for a full day. You need to figure out what's happening. So I would really kind of urge you to think expansively about what is considered a credible source, in particular, folks who are incarcerated, as well as staff.
Yeah, Brittany, maybe you can also add to what Andrew was saying about the state reporting agencies. I think you have some good resources for that, right, that we can share since they're different in every state.
Yeah, I have a link that I will wrestle out and post right now. It is a part of DICRA, like the state reporting plan for each state. I have a friendly little link that I can post. And then the other thing I wanted to add too about like journalists kind of challenging and sort of fighting for death records. I was denied an autopsy in Pittsburgh in 2020 and fought for 3 years, ended up in Commonwealth Court and changed case law in Pennsylvania, making autopsies public. And then we found out that the autopsy didn't exist. So they fought me for 3 years on an autopsy that was never conducted. But we did change case law and make them public, which was a great outcome. And then I moved to Ohio. But that is to say, like getting a no and reading statute and trusting your gut and starting to reach out to places like Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press or, Yale Law Clinic. Like there's so many clinics that are interested in these public access and First Amendment cases, that if you are getting a denial as a journalist and you kind of are having a gut check moment, I would appeal it and see where it goes. Because if it's a denial, how worse can it get? Like, people are always afraid of making worse case law, but if the case law is already bad, it can't really get worse. So I would say appeal it and see where it goes is my 2 cents on that. But I will send this link in a second.
Another tip that I've gotten from Brittany is if you're not getting the records from the agency itself, just try to go to the state, like the Attorney General or any investigating agency that might also have some sort of jurisdiction. So in Texas, the Texas Rangers investigate every death that occurs in a local jail or in custody. So you can ask them for the same information and they might have a different answer than the local agency. And then the other thing I wanted to add about autopsies, and this is something I just learned, I don't know, maybe other people already know, but like you can request the autopsy, and then there's also like a narrative document where the medical examiner writes in sort of more layman's English what happened and their interpretation of how this person died. And that is, I think, a lot more informative than, or it's informative in a different way than the autopsy itself, because sometimes when you're reading the autopsy, it's like highly technical medical language that's very hard to interpret. So I learned about that very recently and found it helpful. Okay, so maybe another thing that I have learned, over the past year looking at this is the different types of deaths that occur in different types of custody, they tend to be very different. So the types of deaths that occur in jails are very different than the types of deaths that tend to occur in prisons, are very different than the types of deaths that tend to occur during the process of arrest, like an interaction with police. So I wonder if our panelists could talk a little bit about like the leading causes of death specific to those different categories of custody.
I can go here, I guess. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that in prisons, the leading cause of death is cancer. And I think that in jails, the leading cause of death is suicide currently. And very qualitatively, when I was putting together that map of deaths in custody, the primary case that I would see was somebody was supposed to receive wellness checks every 15 minutes, and they didn't for a number of hours, and they killed themselves.
Yeah, I do think that there is sometimes an overemphasis on some of these differences. Like some of them are just about the type of population that is housed in that facility, but increasingly, there are 5 states in the US that house more than a quarter of their prison population in a local jail. And then there's an additional 5 states that house more than a quarter of their prison population in a privately run facility. And so, what we see in Louisiana, where we're such a combined jurisdiction, about 50% of our prison population is doing their time in a local jail, is that we're seeing in jails higher, what I think of as more preventable types of deaths. Those deaths that are related to drug use, that are related to mental health, so suicides, as well as higher rates of violent deaths. And but we see it impacting people who are serving sentences as well as people who are pretrial. And so there could be a drug-related death that isn't necessarily within the first 48 hours, although our data does show that in the first 7 days, that probability is worse. But we're seeing drug-related deaths happening in jails a year, 2 years, 3 years in to their stay there. And so there's something about security protocols that is missing there, as well as the availability of Narcan and other types of drugs.
I will add a couple of things that maybe turn our focus to the street side of things. So in my lab, we've pulled crowdsources to get a composite picture of people who've died during law enforcement encounters between 2000 and 2020 nationally. it's around 34,000 people, according to our count, and we believe that's an undercount. When the number one leading cause of the death are firearms. So if you take firearms away, the second leading ways in which police are taking people's lives are with their cars during high-speed pursuits. And this is happening in all unique, different directions. So, and we've actually learned a lot from media when we investigate these cases where police are in unmarked vehicles, they're pursuing a suspect, they run through an intersection and they hit an innocent bystander. Or the suspect is being chased by law enforcement, they do an evasive maneuver, they flip their car over and they kill themselves. So cars are really sort of driving a lot of the deaths that are happening at the national level. And then I think it's useful to think about sort of natural death and undetermined deaths during law enforcement encounters, because a natural death, according to the National Association of Medical Examiners, which is sort of the national governing body that advises death investigators who write these reports, a natural death is what most of us are going to experience, end of our life, usually from some sort of disease or illness in the sort of presence of an attending physician. The question we have to ask ourselves is, can you actually die naturally in the presence of law enforcement? Is it even possible? And certainly, is it possible in a jail environment where every aspect of your life is regulated? And so for us, what we're doing in our lab is looking at the rates of quote unquote dying from natural causes in the free population who are not in jail, who are not being pursued by police, and then seeing, do we find the same rates of death at the same age of people who are in jail? And we're finding a huge gap. In some cases, things like heart conditions, 30-year gap between people who are in the free population who are dying in their 70s or their 60s, and then people in their 40s and their 30s dying from these same conditions. And so I think it's, while you can sort of look at a specific ailment, I think the larger issue is to try to hunker down and question, well, what is a natural death? And do we see the same rates of natural deaths in the free population with the population that's in custody? And there, I think there's a lot of things to be said and written about.
Thank you, guys. Another question that we have coming up in the chat are there any tips for finding friends or loved ones, both how to track them down and how to approach them once you do contact family or friends of the deceased?
Yeah, so, I mean, we're all kind of in this kind of research industry, whether as journalists or academics, you hit the ground running, right? So there's all types of databases that you can use to kind of track down last known address or phone number. But I do think that there is a lot of work that can be done around trauma-informed interviewing, and really being careful. And in some cases, in particular jurisdictions in Louisiana, we know that there are individuals on the ground who are a community resource, just about like, what's happening in the court system. They're kind of those, colloquially we call them the plug, right? They're the people who know how to reach other people. And so part of this work means being grounded in the community in which you're working. And so we often will go to them and say, have you had contact with this family? Is this something that you might be interested in? Often we will try to be inobtrusive, in terms of, we don't just show up on somebody's doorstep. We send a letter. We use respectful language. We don't use words that are considered derogatory for people who are behind bars. We don't make assumptions that people who are accused of certain crimes, one, necessarily did them, or two, that it is the defining thing about that person. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on that so that we don't re-traumatize people who have already suffered an incredible loss. That being said, they are some of our greatest allies in doing this work and have really taught us so much.
Absolutely. If I could just add to that, which I think gets back to a question you asked earlier, Brittany, about what journalists are missing. I think when journalists reach out to people like Andrea or Orion or myself, people who we've been embedded in these communities, we're texting with families nightly sometimes. We're at vigils, we're at funerals, we're at rallies, we're at angelversaries. There's a measure of importance of being there, that we are there. And to reach out to people who are embedded in community, I think it's important to realize that the community trusts us, right? So if you come to us and we connect you with community partners, we're elevating your status, your trust in the eyes of the community. And I think that has to be be done carefully and thoughtfully, because families don't usually know where to turn, but where they will turn are people who are there, people who are texting, people who are present. And if you're going to do this work, and maybe you're not able to be that connected, but you're going to work with someone who is, I think there's an important way to approach that relationships that respects the kind of energy, the investment, and the embeddedness there. And I think this is something that will overall, I think, help family. The other point I'll simply say is that there are some families that are terrified of police and terrified of the jail and terrified of law enforcement, and they don't want to go on record because of intimidation. This is what we're experiencing in Los Angeles, where we have community who are being terrorized by law enforcement because they have open, lawsuits against the county, or they have family members who are in jail and they don't want to go on record because they fear that someone inside jail will be a victim of harm because of them trying to speak out. So these are very sort of delicate situations that I think require slow and careful thinking to kind of navigate, and sometimes turning to community partners or the researchers on the ground who are working on these issues is a good way to kind of get into this space and be thoughtful.
Great, thank you. So Nicole has been collecting a bunch of the questions from the chat. Nicole, maybe you can ask some of those.
Absolutely. So let's see. We had a couple of questions about FOIA records. So many of these stories are built on requests. And so any tips or tricks for accessing or expediting records? One reporter, it seems like they had a citation of over 6 years from the request to receive data. Maybe starting with the reporters, and then we can transition to anyone else who has thoughts on that one.
I don't know if this is something people haven't thought of yet, but something that's helped for FOIAs for medical examiners' offices and just for getting jail rosters online in our broader project is to leverage facilities or agencies against each other, sort of to say like, County A, it's interesting that you don't post this information online, or, that you wouldn't give us this information through FOIA because your neighboring county does. So sort of an obvious tip.
I honestly use that all the time, and it's weird how often it works. It's like, well, this person gave it to me, and then suddenly they do.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also a conversation, right? So, we will send one, and sometimes there's a letter back, and it becomes litigation by letter, right? And sometimes you really just need to get on the phone and call somebody and say, listen, these are the things that I'm looking for. Can you give me these things? And so sometimes it takes me 6 months of conversations to get the records that we're looking for. And sometimes it appears in my email inbox. The other part that I would say about getting these records and challenges around them is really being able to go again to different agencies, right? Like there are lots of different groups that somehow will get a notification or a trigger about something that is happening. It may be looking at the state level versus the local level. It may be going to your legislative arm. So that might be the local Metro Council is getting a report on the healthcare services that are provided, and buried in that report is information about deaths, right? So there's the problem is it's so fragmented, this information, that it seems like it's impossible to find, but that is actually helpful for us because it means that there are lots of different places where you can get a piece, which is enough to pull the thread to unravel.
Thank you. And we started to answer this question, but I want to circle back to it. It's a question from the chat about some of the practices that contribute to deaths in custody. And in particular, a reporter wants to know if how practices like double bunking within prison facilities contribute to mental health issues that people might already have and then lead to, additional deaths.
What I can say in the work that we've done on the jail side of things, solitary confinement is a strong factor for people dying in custody for a whole host of reasons. If someone has a pre-existing health condition that's a mental health issue, sometimes being in solitary confinement exacerbates that health condition. I've looked at cases where someone is detoxing. They're on a drug trying to wean off of some substance dependency, and they're in solitary confinement, which means that they're subject to how often they're being watched or surveilled by the jail deputies inside. And that can often create cases where someone is not found or discovered for hours after they've suffered some sort of health crisis or event. So I would say solitary confinement is a very sort of strong variable when trying to kind of piece together how people are dying inside the jail.
I would definitely agree with that. Our data in Louisiana is showing that of the suicides that are completed within prisons and jails, 2/3 of them were happening within solitary settings, right? So one is thinking about the types of spaces, but we might also think about other practices and places. People tend to put quote unquote natural deaths, which I think of as like medical deaths. In their purest sense, people tend to say, oh, well, those are different. But what we're also seeing is that people are dying at younger ages of more advanced stages of certain diseases. And so we might look at what is the food that is served? Does it fit certain vitamins, nutrients, et cetera, in terms of the FDA? What do we think about in terms of healthcare and the availability of preventative healthcare or well visits? So in most prisons, you don't get an annual visit that is just monitoring your vitals and your cholesterol until you were age 50. They call them the old man physicals at Angola. And so I think there's lots of different practices that we can look at that do lead to deaths that are occurring behind bars, in addition to some of the very important things that Terence just mentioned.
Thank you. Another question about what types of cases actually might be missing from some of the public data sets and how reporters, the people on this call actually might be able to fill some of those gaps.
I can start us off here. Something that I'm working on with a few reporters right now is looking at deaths immediately post-custody, which are not under the jurisdiction of DICRA. You need jail booking records and release dates for people, and you need medical examiners records, and you need to merge them. And in these cases, you can see people who died, from maybe a chronic illness, like 1 or 2 days after having been held in custody for months or years even. And so these cases are, I think, sort of a legal gray area, but they certainly deserve scrutiny.
We are actually doing that right now in Ohio, and we have some of that data, but we're also capturing folks who were released to a hospital right before they died. So that's another, I think, gap is people who were really released and then went out into the world and unfortunately overdosed or were killed in a homicide, but then folks who had some sort of medical condition or something occurred where they end up in an ICU, they are released by the sheriff, and then they aren't counted in DICRA. So that's another piece that you're not going to find that in these data sets, is that kind of circumventing of that reporting through releasing somebody from custody.
What we're finding are there counties or states that allow sheriffs or law enforcement to put a death record on security hold indefinitely. And so what that usually means is the record just won't exist. Now, maybe they will report to DICRA, but if you're working on the ground and you're trying to put a story together about how many people have died at X jail over the last 6 months, and I don't know, 1/3 of those cases are on security hold, whatever the death count is going to be much lower than if you had access to those security holds. And so this is a huge issue because these records should be available to the public, but they can be held in ways that you just won't get access to them. And they're very difficult to find. It's not like there's a data set that allows you to see when a record was available and when it wasn't. It requires often reverse engineering to figure out the date and time of death and whether or not that person appeared on whether it's the county's reporting website or et cetera, to figure out what was placed there or not.
Yeah, there's so many really good questions rolling in. I want to take a second and think about or talk about the sort of sourcing of some of these stories. We've talked a little bit about how to find and work with family members. This is a bit of a modification of a question that came in, but any tips or thoughts on how we can how reporters can acquire correction sources or other sources inside the jails and prisons that can help people figure out what actually happened in any particular death.
I mean, I think it's really helpful to know when the shift changes are and to go hang out at the parking lot, right? I mean, that's a, or, thinking about what is the rhythm of that facility and maybe that shift, and maybe they all tend to stop at this particular gas station to grab, a cold drink or a snack real quick before getting in the car and driving home. And maybe that's a place where you hang out. Again, I think incarcerated people have a really good sense of the temperature and demeanor of folks who work in those buildings, and they can definitely tell you this person, if you talk to them, they're going to tell you the real deal. They're going to tell you what's really happening. And I see this in the records too, right? Some of the records that I read, you can tell that the staff member filling out is trying to draw attention to something egregious, right? I remember there's a record out of a federal facility actually that was filled out where the body was not discovered for 2 days. And they made sure to include that gratuitously. There's no question that asked when the body was found to include that in the notes, right? And so we know that the people who are inside, whether they're incarcerated or their staff, that they are seeing things all of the time. The question is just being proximate enough to where they are so that you can speak with them.
I would say too, the other kind of trick or tip I have is figuring out who the union president is for the corrections officers or the medical care, like nurses union. Presidents have been eventually become pretty good sources for me because they, are often thinking about safety and labor stuff. So there are certain things that they will get on record about and help you with. And that's been a great in for me with a lot of like that's the staff side of things.
We're coming up on our last few minutes, and I apologize for, there's many more questions than we have time to answer them, but I want to sort of take a little bit of a shift and think about potential for strategies and solutions. So the last question here is a combination from the chat and from a pre-submitted, but strategies, for reducing deaths in custody is one thing. And then the second sort of part of that is thoughts on how reporters or other folks can hold public officials accountable for the deaths and for reducing them as well.
I'll go first on this, although I assume that, I mean, with such an expert panel, there's a lot of other suggestions. So first in reducing, I mean, the carceral environment itself can be toxic, right? From the chemicals that are used to clean the walls, sometimes it can make the paint bubble to the food that you were served, etc. And so, the first instance is to say, particularly when we think about jails, is that really the environment that is most conducive to treating this particular condition that a person has, or perhaps even something that led to their criminal behavior, right? And so, one is just thinking about, do we really need that person behind walls? Is there a true public safety threat? But second, when we think about the actual facilities, it is bewildering to me that people who are trained in security are also in charge of running healthcare and libraries and farms and workplaces. That level of expertise, your security expertise, does not necessarily translate into how to run a library, for instance. And so when I think about strategies to reduce death, I think about giving those jobs to the people who are experts. And in part, that creates additional transparency because we all act better when company is coming over, right? And so that means your library service should be run by the librarians, right? That means your healthcare service should be run by the publicly available healthcare services that are available in the rest of the county or in the rest of the state. So Reuters, in their 2019 study, showed that private correctional healthcare providers had higher mortality rates than the mortality rates in institutions where that care was provided by a public entity. So part of the work is breaking the stranglehold that corrections has over all of the myriad of services that they deliver, and instead allowing other government actors who do that work in an expert and trained way to do that work behind the wire as well as outside the wire.
Any other thoughts on, we have like 2 more minutes,
Sure.
thoughts on strategies? Yeah, for
I'll just
public
reiterate
people.
something that I said earlier. I really think, and I agree with everything Andrea is saying. I think we need journalists to make connections between in custody deaths and local politics. And we need journalists that help us understand that this is a new type of capital punishment. People should not be dying in jail, and people should not be dying during arrest. And by and large, there's been less support of capital punishment, certainly for nonviolent offenses. And I just think there needs to be some narrative work to help Americans along the way to understand that these things, these feelings that Americans hold around capital punishment need to be brought over to this crisis that's happening in the jail, especially given how many everyday citizens, working class, poor people, unhoused, people dealing with substance abuse issues are going to circle at one point through the jail environment that we know are taking people's lives prematurely. I think there's got to be some work there. And I think until you start getting the public side to really get invested, I think we're not going to start seeing this change in the way that we need.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle with some closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you to our experts, to our moderators for this just really eye-opening conversation and answering a lot of really thoughtful questions from our audience. We appreciate the audience members taking time out of their day to join in this conversation as well. And for any questions we didn't get to, I have a record of them, and my goal will be to try and reach out in the next couple weeks and see what additional context we can offer. The Marshall Project is also offering consultations for journalists working on these types of stories, so I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. And then, this programming is thanks to the Investigate This initiative from the Marshall Project. So I'm going to share our newsletter so you can sign up and be alerted when we have new resources come out. But thank you, everyone, so much for your time and attention to what is a public health emergency.